Bernadette Corporation, Amy Silman, Greg Bordowitz, Rachel Harrison, Ian Chang, Martine Sims, Plato, Saddam Hussein, and many others. Tonight, we launch and celebrate. That's a good author's roster, I think. Tonight, we add to that roster Carroll Dunham, Into Words, his first collection of writing. He'll be in conversation with Scott, who wrote the introduction to the book and is the chief curator here at the Whitney. He has a much longer title, which I won't remember. After the conversation, there'll be a short Q&A, followed by a book signing here outside the theater. For anyone buying a copy here, you also get a free limited poster designed by me to accompany the book with every purchase. Buy a couple books, in fact, because the holidays is just around the corner. Thank you for supporting independent publishing. And now I give you Carroll Dunham and Scott Rothkopf.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for hosting. You're saying we're hosting, but I feel like you're the host tonight. It's rare that we host something where like the other guy gets up and does the intro, so that's a good sign of collaboration. I'm supposed to face this way, so my mic is working. And I want to repeat what Paul said, but in actually more aggressive terms. Please buy this book. I can say that with impunity because I make no royalties. It's harder if the publisher's trying to sell you something. He probably gets some money out of it, but I don't think I get any. So I'm just saying this out of the kindness of my heart because he's such a great writer, and I hope you will enjoy his writing. I wrote some questions down, but we, I think, should have a very informal conversation. Tip and I have been talking about art and writing for now close to 20 years, 15 years, depending on how you count. And but it's my first time ever to talk to someone about a book and about writing. I've sat on this stage and many others talking about paintings and art, so it's a little bit of a experiment, I think, for us both. And maybe the first time to be interviewed, for you to be interviewed as an author.
Totally.
So maybe I just want to start by saying something about the book. As Paul mentioned, I wrote an introduction, and it spans writings from the mid-90s to just a couple of years ago, and there's also some great interviews that Tip has done with other artists, including Laurie Simmons, who shot the cover photograph. But I kind of want to start at the beginning, in a way. The first text in here is from '94, and it's on Miro. And so, first of all, had you written much before that? And second of all, what got you to first write something for publication?
No, I hadn't. I had written one essay for publication when I was 24 years old, and it was about Mel Bachner, and I was very scared of it. It was a good experience, but I knew that my art was. I never wanted writing to be something that was out ahead of my artwork, and I really put the idea of writing out of my mind for a long time. And I always kept notebooks and journals, wrote down a lot of ideas, but I didn't think about it as something I would really pursue seriously. And then Jack Benkowski, who was the editor at Art Forum in the 90s, asked me to write an obituary. Well, I guess actually the first thing he asked me to do was to weigh into some kind of writing symposium about a big Miro exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, and it was a very light assignment, so I thought, well, I could try that. And I kind of enjoyed the experience. And then my friend, the artist Peter Kane, died, and Jack asked me if I would write an obituary about him. And that was something I felt I had to do because I was so interested in his work. And after that was longer and much more demanding, but afterwards I felt very satisfied by the experience. And then the editors, it was before you were there, and then after you came, it continued. The editors at Art Forum just kind of kept asking me if I wanted to do things, and I found I did.
I'm interested in what you just said about this idea that you didn't want your writing to get out ahead of your art. And I hadn't thought about this until I sat down to write the introduction, but I don't want to say you're unique, but you're rare among artist writers, it seems to me, who begin writing about art more in life, let's say.
Or even earlier.
You know, that there's so many artist writers, if we think of them from the 60s, someone like a Don Judd or Mel Bachner, who you mentioned, or more recently, people like Francis Stark or Uta Kurter, and that you get the sense of them becoming writers either to pay the rent or to clear the field. You can't really pay the rent freelance writing, but you could maybe find a place for yourself and chart an argument, and then you leave the writing behind when you become a successful artist, or you keep doing it a little, but you sort of came into writing, I think, relatively late for an artist writer.
Kind of backwards from the way most artists' writing seems to evolve. I mean, it was never really, I think a lot of those people you mentioned, maybe Judd particularly, Bruce Boyce was another artist during the 70s who was writing a lot, and I felt like they were preparing the way for their art with their writing, not in a creepy way, in a kind of interesting way, you know, like by deciding how to have standards that would also account for what they wanted to do. And my situation was different because I didn't have a clear agenda, and the time that I came of age in was much murkier than that. So I really just had my own taste and my own interests, and at a certain point, I realized if I spent the rest of my life alone in my studio, I was going to go nuts. So it would be kind of interesting to try to do that at a different point. I was aware of all this, you know, that it was kind of odd to be, 50 years old and decide, you know, I think I'm really going to try to do this. But I suppose the advantage is that I'd read a lot of other people's writing. You know, I had a real sense of what I liked in writing.
Could you, you jumped one of my questions. Could you talk about the writers that you like, either the writers on art or the writers on anything?
I can't say specifically, you know, I just love, hence the title of the book, I just love words, and I love reading a kind of the texture, the voice of writing. When I was younger, I read a lot of novels. You know, I read Saul Bellow and Walker Percy, and I read quite a bit of philosophy, which is a completely different kind of writing. Art criticism has become more and more, in many ways, more and more difficult to read and to have a whole lot of fun with it. But there were, I think probably my favorite stylist as a writer about art is Fairfield Porter, who I got really interested in as I began writing and realized that he was a person that I wanted to know more about, both as an artist and as a writer. But it's more just the kind of, like I say, the sort of general idea that there's a writer can have a voice. You know, you can find a relationship to language that's yours. Mm-hmm. That idea is very appealing to me.
Mm-hmm. I think you have a very clear one on the page. One of the things I should say, I don't know if this is a disclaimer or not, is that many of the texts in this book I edited when it was now a sort of long time ago, when I had first came to work at Artforum in 2004, and you became a more frequent contributor to the magazine and also writing at greater length.
Well, I think so many of these things are based on relationships. I mean, I would not have... probably the clearest analogy for me in my artwork is working in print studios. If you don't like the people in the room, you can't work. And the feeling of being welcomed as a writer, and that you guys at the magazine were kind of up for that and up for indulging. You know, I was an extremely late adapter to things digital, so Scott and I had to sit down with a legal pad and go through and, you know, do this whole thing. It was very labor intensive, but it also,
what is that?
It was very intimate and a lot of fun. So, yeah, the personal side of it was significant to me. I looked as I wasn't kidding when I said if I spent the rest of my life alone in a painting studio, that wouldn't be good. So, I liked the kind of combination of isolation and sociability that it involved. So you guys were a big part of that.
what we didn't tell him at the time was we always gave him the assignment for which there was no other writer. I'm only kind of half kidding, but what was interesting for me, when we're talking about the stage in Tip's life that he was in when he started writing, and when I became editor, I was in my late 20s, and there were these shows that were happening of artists that were a little maybe older than Tip, but people that he was very interested in. And I'll say some of their names, and some of you will know who they are: Joe Zucker, Elizabeth Murray, Barry LeVay, all artists in the Whitney's collection, but not artists, I would say, that most of our writers who were coming out of the academy generally, or freelance kind of writers, had much interest in. And I had a great interest in them, and I didn't really know much about them because they weren't artists that I ever would have studied in college or graduate school. And the way that Tip became this, I realized I said in the introduction, this kind of secret weapon for me as an editor, because I kind of knew that you would get this stuff and you wouldn't put it down, and you would sort of see a place that it came from. And you maybe were ready to, instead of clearing the way, you were ready in retrospect to look at what some of these artists might have meant to you. And I wonder if you would just pick any of them, whether it was Elizabeth or Joe Zucker or Barry, and kind of talk about maybe how you first encountered their work as an artist, and then thinking about their work from the writerly lens.
Well, Barry is an interesting example because I knew him. He was friends with older artists that I either worked for or helped, and he was always very nice to me. We talked a lot, and I actually worked with Klaus Curtis, helping him a few times when he had his gallery, installing pieces of Barry's that, we'd get these crazy letters with all these diagrams and notes and things, and Klaus was sort of tearing his hair out, and he and I together would sit down and say, well, looks like we need like 100 dowels, and they have to go here, here, and here, So I had a real up close and personal thing with Barry LeVay's art. Cut to whatever, 20 years, 30 years later, I don't even know. And it seemed to me that there wasn't a sufficient appreciation of his role in things, and the way that it needed to be framed just wasn't being done. A lot of artists of that generation were being kind of moved into some sort of, older, masterful, not blue chip exactly, but kind of, they were being anointed in some way, and it seemed to me like Barry was being somewhat bypassed. And I felt that way about a number of those artists that, they're basically 10 years older than I was, so the kind of people that you think are gods when you're 22. And I wanted to say something about that. So it's almost the opposite of laying the groundwork for your own work. It's kind of like after you've done a lot of your own work, you realize what you actually were interested in. Mm-hmm. And I had no real concern about my taste being embarrassing, because I didn't really care at that point. So, or Elizabeth is another example of someone. She had a big show at the Museum of Modern Art, but there was a feeling that I had that a lot of people just didn't even understand it, didn't know what it was really about. And my friends and I were all thought she was amazing, that she was very important. And I thought I could say something about that maybe.
I think you did. I think we all have to keep reminding ourselves that generations in the art world are like the length of the generations of fruit flies at this point, and the way that we think about this. Actually, I'm doing a show with Laura Owens. We're installing right now. She's here tonight. And we put a text about Elizabeth Murray by Francine Prose, not by you, sorry, in the catalog.
It's okay.
Because it sort of felt important to me that we should keep kind of reaching back to histories that were not that far away, that get kind of elided for whatever reason as a kind of marker. I think what you gave me a good segue by choosing Barry. If you don't mind, I will now read some of your writing in a British accent.
As long as I don't,
just kidding.
As long as I don't have to do it.
But I want. It's sort of weird. We don't have pictures, so I thought, well, how do you do this and make your voice on the page at least come to life. And I copied a quote actually from your text on LaVey because I thought of it, I'll say it by further introduction of this. When we were working on these pieces together, I had no clue that they would kind of add up to something. And it was just like what we were doing,
neither,
and we were
man.
having fun, and we were looking at art, and having these great conversations. And for me, it was like this like seminar in graduate school that didn't exist because they wouldn't have talked about those people. And at the same time, when I read them all together, again, 10 years later, I haven't worked with you for a really long time now, I was very surprised by how many through lines there were between the texts. And I tried to talk about some of them in the introduction. And one was really the way that you were so attentive to the artist process, and not just in the kind of cliche way of course, an artist can see the way another artist makes something, but the way really that an artist's mind or their sensibility kind of interacts in this kind of triangulation with the thing they're making and the world they're living in. And one of the great phrases about Barry that you said, which is almost kind of shamanistic, and I couldn't really imagine art critics saying it, but it felt so true to me, was you said, "I imagine LaVey operating at the quiet center of a raging storm of data, but emphatically not the digital kind. His work isn't so much pre-digital as it is part of another continuum, artifacts of an imaginary society where people send rockets to the moon using the abacus instead of the computer." And I was like, that is so crazy. But then it somehow kind of makes sense. And this, you have this kind of weird genealogical time. It's not the Anthropocene, it's the like, so many of these texts, you're kind of like linking the future and cavemen or something through like 1977. And I wonder if you could talk about that, kind of your sense of those artists, and that's a kind of recurring feeling in the
I
work.
think that's my sense of all art, you know, including what's interesting to me to make art. I mean, honestly, if I'm really candid, the biggest influence on my imagination as a writer is science fiction. I've been reading science fiction chronically since I was a kid. A lot of the imagery, the metaphors, the kind of world view of that type of writing has completely soaked into my view of things. And I also am really interested in the archaic aspect of artwork, you know, the fact that it is something humans have been getting up to for an extremely long time, arguably one of our first original moves. So it seems interesting to me to try to think about contemporary art as an embodiment of archaic human consideration. And I know, or concerns, and I know this is not a very of the moment way of thinking, because everything is so bound up right now with the immediate, like sort of the instantaneous qualities of the culture as it moves along. But for it to mean anything, really, it has to go further than that, or it won't have any staying power at all. So, you know, Barry's work is so loopy, so off in its own tangent, but also so, it's exactly, I mean, I still feel what I said back then, you know, that it's as though he's thinking up a completely different way to compute. And that the sculptures and drawings are embodiments of that. But I think it's true of a lot of contemporary art.
There's another passage that I think is really beautiful in terms of this description of the kind of inside-outside of the artist's head or in their process and maybe their place in the world. And I thought I'd read it also because it's about Rauschenberg, and I'm sure many people here saw the Rauschenberg show, more than maybe saw the Barry LaVey show at the ICA Philadelphia in 2005.
That seems likely.
So we'll cut to Rauschenberg. This is on the Combines. As attempts to transcend normal notions of selfhood, the Combines explore deeply the defining conditions of personality. They are the products of a solitary and somewhat isolated consciousness working improvisationally with the matter and emotions directly at hand, a projection of Rauschenberg's mind and body onto the intimate and alienated world of the studio. In a sense, they are all one thing, the aftermath left by the sensitive and acquisitive tidal wave of the artist's awareness as it crashed into reality and then receded. That's like a passage that I'm still jealous that I didn't write. but
Maybe you did.
Oh, no wonder I keep coming back to it. but I think there's some kind of depth of understanding in that, maybe, of what it feels like to be in the studio and to have things in your hand, and of this kind of dawning consciousness, but also you're kind of in awe of Rauschenberg, and so there's this way that you can talk about these things sort of differently than I could, in a kind of intimacy and maybe projection. Maybe there's also sometimes a quarrel to be had.
Yeah, I think all of that. And a lot of these, I considered Rauschenberg's existence to be a huge influence on my thinking about an artist, about being an artist, in ways that I'm sure are not obvious in my artwork. But I was always fascinated by the kind of consciousness that could come up with that project. And the Combines are arguably the sort of the essential piece of that, or at least the essential launching point of that. So I found myself thinking a lot about what the subjectivity of that would be. And it seems as important to, when you're thinking about art like that, it seems as important to try to imagine the subjectivity as it is to try to describe or critique the material. It seems like you have to go back and forth between inner and outer reality in order to really get it.
Well, I think that's something that is so needed, but probably not so common in the way art historians and critics think about writing now, because they're trying to, more separate that, or have been for quite some time. And I think you really, show us something there.
Well, I don't know. I'm sure a lot of people think about this, and I don't have time to read all the contemporary art writing that's out in the world, so I can't. I don't really want to generalize exactly. I guess I'm about to, but it does seem odd that you can be a very intelligent and fairly culturally literate person and read long-form either criticism or exegesis in magazines like the New York Review of Books or the New Yorker. You can read about things that you don't know all of the sort of inside baseball lingo, and you can come away feeling like you kind of understand. And that seems to be less obvious with contemporary art writing. And I think that's a question that's of interest. It's interesting to me. I think it should be interesting to all of us who are interested in contemporary art. Like, why is this stuff so hard to talk about without resorting to these navel-gazing maneuvers?
But is that the problem of the writer or the artist?
I have no idea. In terms of what I'm framing, I suppose it's the problem of the writer, although everything has, it really was my generation of people here in New York at least, that were really educated about, went to art school, did all that, learned art history. So, and how to position contemporary art within that kind of thing, rather than just, it's the trend towards academicization of writing and art thinking, I think, has been pretty continuous during this last period of time. A lot of that has resulted in really, really interesting art and interesting writing, but I'm not that person, I guess that's really a long way of saying, I know that I have nothing to offer as an academic writer, so I have to come up with something else.
You did. Your comment on, I'm going to jump ahead because you kind of keep giving me segues, so I'm following your lead, on the 1970s and New York and your generation. I had flagged this passage, which is a little longer, so maybe I'll skip ahead a bit, but it sort of sets up your essay on Elizabeth Murray, where you're kind of looking at the field from, let's say, 2005, and you kind of map this world with a kind of surety and a clarity that most, I think, art historians would not have the nerve to do because we'd be too afraid of generalizing. And also, when you say, oh, the 70s, that was like such a crazy time compared to the 60s, and I would say, well, whoever expected, like, how would we define the time we're in now? But I want to read something about this.
Really crazy.
Really crazy. It just gets crazier. This kind of way that you map this world that seems that you know it with such intimacy, and when you read across the text, this feeling of like New York as almost its own planet. And I don't know if you felt like New York was its own planet or the world. You did?
I did.
Okay, well.
I did, and I think my friends did. I mean, I don't want to speak for anybody, but yeah, that's what it felt like. The art world was tiny then compared to what it is now, and it was even, the 70s was before we were confronted with all the new art from Europe, which was part of the kind of the 80s that really happened, as opposed to the 80s that people wish happened. Like all this crazy painting coming from Germany and Italy and wherever. But the 70s was before all that, and it did feel like a little monopoly board. Part of it was in Soho, and part of it was on 57th Street, and it was possible to know what was going on, and it was possible to sort of judge and evaluate, and this is good, this is bad. I mean, that's easier when you're young anyway.
Well, then I don't even have to read this passage because you explained it without, I should wait and save my question and do the reading first. But I do think that that's one of the things in the book that surprised me when I read it backwards is the sort of elegance with which you map this time in the world, the time that you were coming up in a way in retrospect, but then also thinking like, but hey, like I want to like, but what are you missing, or how could this have been so tidy? I mean, I like that monopoly board analogy, which is not in your writing. I'll skip that then, so we don't have to read that. Another theme that came up when I reread all the text that I think is very moving and kind of a signature aspect of the book, and it may have something to do with the time in your life at which you began writing, as you said, in your 50s, and now, well, you're, 15 years older.
Older than that.
But is you're writing about artists' late work and artists late in their lives. And you're definitely not late in your life, I'm not saying that, but you have a kind of insight about this that is rare. And I think that there is this trope of art historians saying like, yeah, Monet got really crazy at the end, or Titian. I mean, we know that, but you write about it, or Matisse's cutouts, let's say, with a kind of felt sense of experience that's really moving. And so I'm going to read something about you on late Renoir, which is also another one of those topics that probably we could not have found anyone else to accept that assignment. It is impossible to appreciate these last paintings without understanding the artist's physical situation in old age. A painter's body is his first and primary tool, and all painting is a negotiation between the psychophysical patterns of the artist and the fabric of expectations that surround him. In 1897, Renoir fell from a bicycle and broke his arm, descending into a crippling rheumatoid arthritis that left him wheelchair-bound for most of his final 2 decades. Here is a description of his condition from his son Jean's memoir. Quote, his hands were terribly deformed, his rheumatism had made the joints stiff and caused the thumbs to turn inward towards the palms and his fingers to bend towards the wrists. Visitors who were unprepared for this could not take their eyes off this deformity. End quote of Jean Renoir. Back to Tip. There is a jarring film clip among the memorabilia of the exhibition, scratchy and jumpy old black and white footage, which shows the artist sitting before his easel in his wheelchair, using a wrist harness to hold his brush, alternately jabbing at a canvas and smoking. His urgency and aggression illustrate these enthusiastic, guilt-free gravity with which Renoir approached these wildly misunderstood pictures. And you want to talk about how your work has changed as you've aged, or your body, or how you've used your writing to think about these late artists? I have another great passage that you wrote on late Jasper Johns, but it's
I don't know. I guess when you're younger, you kind of think you're trying to learn art history, you're trying to figure out what's important, what's good, and you tend to focus on where people get into the conversation. I was thinking about it upstairs looking at that black Stella, like it's very clear what to do with Frank Stella when he was making the black paintings, and it's not so clear what to do with Frank Stella now. That's not a judgment, it's just that it got a lot more complicated. And I think a lot of artists, my feeling about someone like Renoir or Johns or Picasso or, there are a number of people that as they either got older or have gotten older, their project got deeper. But that as a culture, we tend not to know what to do with them other than make sure their things either cost a lot of money or disappear from the face of the earth. But how to really think about a project that goes on for 40, 50, 60, 70 years, that goes deeper and deeper along the same vector, is not something that one reads about very often. And I guess probably as a function of having made my own art for longer and longer, that started to be really interesting to me. And I also just find on the level of taste, I actually like Renoir's late paintings. I'm not making that up. There's something I feel when I'm in front of them that's completely unique, and it's not about like, oh, they could have been made by a much younger, friskier man. They were made by an old cripple, and they're amazing, and that's all part of what's beautiful about them. And it seemed like an area to explore that I wasn't seeing. It's interesting to try to write about things other people aren't really dealing with. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly not true of a lot of these things, like Johns or Rauschenberg. You could sink a ship with the amount of stuff that's been written about them. But
I think the attention to this question of lateness is not that common in the way that it's certainly not most art historians think about an artist's work. You get the monograph, and the first 3/4 of the book is about the first 10% of the and then there's
Well, we have the Johns triple flag upstairs. It's a perfect example. The sort of iconic Jasper Johns, and if you look at that compared and sort of juxtaposed with what he's been doing in the last 10, 15 years, it's sort of, whoa. Well, it's a lot easier actually to talk about the flag and to say how that changed things and what that did. But I think his work is still doing a lot, and somehow that needs to be,
My last quote that I'll read of yours, since you gave me the perfect segue, this is about Johns, late Johns, but also how Johns might be seen at different points from when you first encountered the work to today. There was a time when Johns was seen by many as the definitive paradigm shifter, parked squarely across any road an ambitious younger artist might take in the future. The problem with this approach to history is the freezing in place of living artists within a theoretically useful but artificially static slice of their own trajectory, which fails utterly to account for the growth in time of individual experience. These after artists also have to live after themselves, and Johns' solution to that problem, if indeed he himself ever saw it as such, has been instructive. What's his solution to the problem?
Just go deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. That's kind of all any artist can do, I think. And, it's a pretty amazing thing to watch.
You gave me an idea I see David Breslin, art director of the collection, is here, that we should try a collection installation where we install it with all of the latest works of artists that we own rather than the earliest, which we tend to do it the other way around.
That would be a good thing to do.
See what that would look like.
Yeah.
I'm looking at Megan. I don't know I haven't been looking at the time. Should we have some questions? And we want to leave time for all of you to be able to buy books and have Tip inscribe them personally with very heartfelt dedication.
Yep. Is this on? Yeah. I think actually you wrote criticism before you were 24. I think I'm right about this. When you were in New York, and I was there too, in your senior year, we were all apprenticed with other artists, and under the guise or the sponsorship, I guess, of Terry Lanou, and as you may or may not remember, we were required to write art criticism for credit in our senior year at college.
Boy, that's a blank.
Well, clearly,
I've got nothing.
We had to do that as part of the semester that we spent down in the city, and if you've forgotten it, well, then I guess it had very little influence on your
This
writing.
gentleman and I went to college together, so that's what he's talking about. Yeah. And I actually don't remember, Peter, but we certainly spent a lot of time talking about each other's artwork. I mean, that was the format of teaching, as it still is.
Yeah. Well, that was why I raised it, because it seemed unusual for an art department, it was studio art department that we were in, to be forced to write about other artists, as Terry made us do.
Yeah, boy, I mean, I think it's just kind of gone, but I believe you.
Yeah.
While the microphone is changing hands, I do have another question. If there are others from you, we'll have them too. But this is such a kind of, maybe it's a cliche question, but I can't help myself. Has writing about art changed the way you make art? Do you think it's had any impact, or on the way you see?
I honestly can't say that it has. I mean, I don't have an experience like that. I do. Well, maybe that's not good. Maybe maybe sentences go through my inner life in a more vivid way than they might have done before. Like, I do think sometimes, oh, you could say this about that, but that doesn't mean I do. That doesn't mean I do. And I don't, other than just making me feel more that I have to really respect my own interests as an artist, that I have to do my work and try to really know what that is. I think writing about other artists that I admire makes me realize what an urgent part of being an artist that is, because that's what I admire in other artists. That's kind of all I know about it.
And I should say, I think if you were listening from the audience, you might get the sense that this book was full of essays about artists that were older than you, or that you encountered kind of early, and that's not actually the case. There's quite a lot of essays about artists who emerged after you did. Kara Walker, Chris O'Feely. I could look at the table of contents, and I wonder, Mark Grochon I see here, how you choose those artists, or what it's like. Does it feel different when you're writing about a younger artist, or where is that kind of impulse coming from, if not so much this kind of reconciliation with the past?
Yeah, it's different. I don't know. I don't know how I would. I mean, it must be different in some way, because those people have less history, and I don't have the same. I'm older than they are, so I've seen things they haven't seen. But those also, it's interesting because most of those things have been done not for magazines. I mean, as I was having more essays published, I guess people started to think, oh, well, Dunham is actually some sort of writer, and people started asking me to write things, like galleries would ask me. And if they were artists I liked a lot, that was a really nice thing to do. So, like the thing about Grosjean and the thing about Ellen Birkenblit were done for Anton Kern, catalogs they made. And those are people who I don't know, I really admire, and I suppose I think they're Michael Williams is another one. People that I think are continuing art making by I don't know, standards or values that I understand and support. So I want to try to say something about it. I am aware that I may not completely know what their reference frames are. But I don't feel like that should stop me from appreciating it or having something, of my own to say.
And do you feel like this project, if it is that, it's gonna keep going? Are there more people you're itching to write about? Is there more writing you're wanting to do, or do you?
Well,
will there be a volume 2 of this book, Paul?
I can't speak about that, but I've written a couple of things since the cutoff of that book, and I've done a couple of interviews with people. I mean, I'm pretty involved with my artwork right now, but I don't want to not do this anymore. I feel like it's been whatever this means, good for me, and I just don't see why I shouldn't try to keep doing it.
More questions? Oh, Mike found a person.
Hi. I have a question about, in 2006, for a gallery show you wrote about your own work. And I wanted to know about what that felt like to switch from, Tip Dunham, the art viewer, art critic, to really Tip Dunham, the artist, writer, that collapse when you're writing about your own work.
It's interesting because we haven't talked about that, and there are, 4 or 5 things in the book that are that. And it's very different. The first things I wrote about my own work were very different. They were much, I suppose, they're more, for lack of a better word, poetic, or looser with the facts. Like just trying to say something about what led to things and what it felt like to make things. And the most serious, essay things I've written have been about printmaking. 2 different, one about printmaking in general and one about making monotypes. And those were both for books about my own work. And I was nervous at first about doing it. It felt very narcissistic. But then I thought, no, people don't get printmaking. And I really have a point of view about it, and I feel like it's something I ought to try to do. So those are, in a way, more like me leaving myself and writing as though I were looking at myself. And the more kind of impressionistic texts were more about trying to get at the feelings of what it was to make a certain body of work. Or I actually would like to write, in a way, when I think about writing going forward, I think more about that than I do about essays, because I feel like it would be interesting to try to capture some analog of what it feels like to think about painting for myself, But it is definitely different.
Hi. Is this on? Oh, okay. One of the things that we've talked a lot about, Tip, is your interest in kind of telling a more expansive story. And when you mentioned Kara Walker and Ophelia, maybe started thinking about the Carrie James Marshall piece that you wrote. And because the art world has been so rocked by issues of identity right now, I wonder if you would discuss a little bit your interest in really approaching artists of color and women with the same kind of rigor that you approach, Rauschenberg and Johns in terms of your writing.
Well, I feel like we have to try to do that. I mean, those are all artists that I love what they do. They're all black. They've all had a completely different life experience than I have, but I believe I'm feeling something when I look at their work. Mm-hmm. And without presuming, I feel like, that discussion can't, I don't want to live in a world where that discussion is the province of identity groups. I just don't want to live in that world. So I choose not to, Like, the only time I ever got a letter to the editor, it was when Scott and I were working together, was when I wrote the piece on Rauschenberg, and I was taken to task by a professor of gay studies about the fact that I hadn't unpacked one of his paintings as around the issue of him being gay and of gay content. And I felt bad about that at the time, but I also knew that I got to look at these things the way, I mean, I'm a straight white guy. There's nothing I can do about that. But I know that all these other things mean something. So, I don't know. I mean, Kerry James Marshall is an extremely impressive artist, and I wanted to say something about him. And he also, it got me thinking a lot about the way that so-called formal discourse and so-called identity politics have been kept separate from each other, and how maybe they need to collapse into each other in some way. And that was something I wanted to try to say. I don't know, it's a free country.
Is it me? I have a question that relates to, and you've discussed a lot of writing assignments you've taken on for artists that you admired. And I'm curious if you have taken on, you don't have to say names, but I'm curious if you've taken on assignments for artists whose work just sort of, you weren't actually drawn to, but an assignment proposed to you might have actually allowed you to kind of dig deeper.
Not really. I only want to write about, I only really want to deal, that's why I always balk when people refer to anything I'm doing as criticism, because I don't see it that way. I see it as boosterism, if nothing, I'm only interested really in, I take potshots at things when I, kind of driving past to another place, but I'm not interested in writing negatively, and I'm not really interested in writing about things that I'm not quite excited about. I just don't see a role for me there. Like Fairfield Porter was a real art critic, Mel Bachner was a real art critic for a while. That's something artists have done. But that kind of, by the time I started getting into it seriously, that wasn't something I was going to do.
Maybe it's time to, Lori's got a question.
Uh-oh.
Last question.
Here comes trouble.
We're going to get to that book buying.
No, I actually have a question for Scott.
Uh-oh.
For Scott as an editor, not Scott the curator. When you are editing the work of artist writers, do they get any sort of special dispensation? Because we have artist friends that we know are tormented by their editors. And it seemed like when you were editing Tip or working with him, there were you let him make up words, tell tall tales.
He was very permissive.
Yeah. Do you feel like you're approaching editing an artist's work with a different sense of justice?
No, but definitely a different sense of care and a different, one of the things that I was very happy about in this, thinking about your book, but also actually I edited a book of Glenn Ligon's collected writings, and Glenn was someone who, like you, he's a bit younger than you, but started writing a little more later, and has become an incredible writer. And sort of through the process of us working together, those were when he wrote some of his first kind of long-form essays. And I was really gratified, maybe also because in 2004, I was finding it difficult to find writers who I was that interested in the academy. There were certainly those famous professors that you would see, but the quality of people who were my age and their voice on the page in their 20s at that time felt often very academic, and they were aspiring PhD students, and I was too, and then I dropped out and didn't get my PhD, but I felt that the voice and working with artists was something that I could take really seriously and try to let them be kind of real writers. There's a convention that goes back a long time of these sort of as told to pieces. Lots of different magazines do them. in catalogs where you interview the artist and then you turn it into these like paragraphs, and it doesn't look like an interview anymore. But that's not like really writing an article. And I sort of think that at this time, around 2004, whenever it was that we met, 2005, I became interested in seeing like which artists could really kind of write like the big essay. Josiah McElhaney was someone I worked with in depth like that. Andrea Zittel was. They were not artists who had written at length, and trying to like really hear their voice and not make them all sound like robots. The very first piece I ever edited professionally, this is actually a funny story in relation to that, was a text I inherited because I had just started, and it was a text by Tacita Dean, who I'd never met, who is a very scholarly person. And I remember I got this phone call from her. She was living in Berlin at the time, and I was the second day on the job. And she said, I just got the edit back from this other editor. And not only did I not write those words, I can't imagine ever writing them or ever having written them. And I want to withdraw the piece. And I thought, oh my God, back to grad school, please. But it was really instructive because I said to Tacita, look, the job that we're doing here is not to make artists sound like art critic robots. It's to like understand that you have this way of thinking and talking about other people's work. And so let's forget that edit and start over and see how we can work together to find something that feels like writing to me and feels like you to you. And so there was a kind of special dispensation, but not in a way that felt overly permissive. I think with that, we'll end. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Tip. Thank you. Congratulations.